Thanks for listening to the Family Bible Journey podcast, where we are leaving the legacy of faith by journaling through the Bible. This is episode 267, season 1 of the Family Bible Journey Old Testament podcast. Today we're looking at Nehemiah chapter 13. The title of today's podcast is Persisting in Good. And our key verses for today are the entirety of chapter 13. But before we read this chapter in its entirety, it's something that we don't often do in this podcast. I want to just give you a little preface, because between chapter 12, where the people were rejoicing in the faithful leadership and the wonderful work that had been accomplished, largely in part to the leadership of Nehemiah and faithful Ezra the priest, Nehemiah was called back to serve in the Persian royal court. And when he came back to Jerusalem some years later, we see that things had gone sideways while he was gone. After he had rebuilt the wall and reestablished the work of the temple there, he returned to his official duties. And while he was away, the old saying goes, while the cat is away, the mouse will play, and the mice played indeed. There were many people who had opposed his work that worked very hard to undo much of the good that he had done. And so what we're going to hear in chapter 13 is the story of many things that had gone sideways, and we want to consider how Nehemiah proved faithful even in the midst of very difficult things, as his words and his work had been thrown back in his face, and the people proved to be very ungrateful to him. But he, holding people accountable, once again righted the ship and turned the people's attention back to the work that God had called them to do there in Jerusalem. And so we begin our reading in chapter 13, verse 1. On that day they read from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people, and it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God, for they did not meet the people of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. Yet our God turned the curse into a blessing. As soon as the people heard the law, they separated from Israel all those of foreign descent. Now before this, Eliashib the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, and who was related to Tobiah, prepared for Tobiah a large chamber, where they had previously put the grain offering, the frankincense, the vessels, and the tithes of grain, wine, and oil, which were given by commandment to the Levites, singers, and gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priests. While this was taking place, I was not in Jerusalem. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went to the king, and after some time I asked leave of the king and came to Jerusalem, and I then discovered the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah, preparing for him a chamber in the courts of the house of God. And I was very angry, and I threw out all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber. Then I gave orders, and they cleansed the chambers and brought back there the vessels of the house of God with the grain offering and the frankincense. I also found out that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them, so that the Levites and the singers who did the work had fled each to his field. So I confronted the officials and said, "Why is the house of God forsaken?" And I gathered them together and set them in their stations. Then all Judah brought the tithe of the grain, wine, and oil into the storehouses. And I appointed as treasurers over the storehouses Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and Pedaiah of the Levites, and as their assistant Hanan the son of Zakur, son of Mattaniah, for they were considered reliable, and their duty was to distribute to their brothers. Remember me, O God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for his service. In those days I saw in Judah people treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in heaps of grain, and loading them on donkeys, and also wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them on that day when they sold food. Tyrians also, who lived in the city, brought in fish and all kinds of goods and sold them on the Sabbath to the people of Judah in Jerusalem itself. Then I confronted the nobles of Judah and said to them, "What is this evil thing that you are doing, profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers act in this way? And did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on this city? Now you are bringing more wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath." As soon as it began to grow dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors should be shut and gave orders that they should not be opened until after the Sabbath. And I stationed some of my servants at the gates, that no load might be brought in on the Sabbath day. Then the merchants and the sellers of all kinds of wares lodged outside Jerusalem once or twice. But I warned them and said to them, Why do you lodge outside the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you. From that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath. Then I commanded the Levites that they should purify themselves and come and guard the gates to keep the Sabbath day holy. Remember this also in my favor, O my God, and spare me according to the greatness of your steadfast love. In those days also I saw the Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, and half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, and they could not speak the language of Judah, but only the language of each people. And I confronted them, and cursed them, and beat some of them, and pulled out their hair. And I made them take oath in the name of God, saying, You shall not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons, or for yourselves. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin on account of such women? Among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was beloved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, foreign women made even him to sin. Shall we then listen to you and do all this great evil and act treacherously against our God by marrying foreign women? And one of the sons of Jehoiada, the son of Elishabib, the high priest, was the son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite. Therefore I chased him from me. Remember them, O my God, because they have desecrated the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and of the Levites. Thus I cleansed them from everything foreign, and I established the duties of the priests and the Levites, and each in his work. And I provided for the wood offering at the appointed times and for the first fruits. Remember me, O God, for good. This is the word of the Lord. So in this chapter, Nehemiah gets to confront many of the people who had sought to undo the good and faithful work that he had done by promoting his enemies, even allowing one of them to live inside the temple itself. Even the son and grandson of some of the great religious leaders of God's people, marrying daughters of the men who literally opposed the work of rebuilding the city of Jerusalem. And so we see an unholy mixing here of political and religious alliances that threaten to undo all the good and faithful work of Nehemiah. And this is a concern that many people have, is it not? That the good work that God has put on our hearts and minds to do for him, that it would be undone even during our lifetimes or after our lifetime. And Nehemiah gets the rare chance, he's gone for some time, many would say that it was over a decade, to come back, to survey what had happened in his absence, and rectify once again many of the evil things that were happening in Jerusalem. And so in this story, Nehemiah gets to do what many people never get to do. And so many people wonder and they worry over whether or not what they do is going to be brought to naught by the coming generations. And certainly Nehemiah's work was being diminished even during his own lifetime. And there are many lessons that we can learn here in this passage. I have a couple of notes here that I want to share with you. The first one is a word of wisdom from chapter 13, verse 2, where it says, God turns curses into blessings. One of my favorite Old Testament stories of Balaam is evidence of that fact. Also, on verse 7, I have a note that they had turned the Lord's house into a house for a man, and not just any man even, but actually one of the enemies of the restoration of God's house. And this is just a tragedy and a tremendous evil that is recorded for us. And then also a couple of notes on stewardship in chapter 13. Verse 10, it says, when God's people don't give, the workers suffer. And there is no lack of material resource in the world that we live in. Yet many churches, many institutions of the church, many missions of the church, many ministries of the church are shuttering their doors, closing their doors, not because there is a lack of material wealth in this world, but because God's people are no longer giving to the work of the Lord. And I'm not even going to get into that subject in depth right now, but I've done a lot of research. It is matter of fact that statistically, people who claim the name of Christ are giving much less to charity now than they were pre-pandemic. And there is no reason for it other than our hearts are growing further away from the Lord. So let's be aware of that for ourselves and recognize that when God's people don't provide for the work of the Lord, that the work of the Lord is hindered and it is not prospered. And Another words of wisdom on verse 14, where it says, God will remember the good that you do for him. This is a great encouragement for us as people of God to know that God will remember the good that we do for him and that he is going to leave for us a legacy of blessed memory. As we here today are reading about the faithful works of a man committed some 2,400 years ago, almost 2,500 years ago, that God also is going to preserve the good that we do for his own name's sake. So that even though we, like Nehemiah, often are tempted to worry as to whether or not the good things that we do would come to an end after our time has come to a close, that God is faithful, and he is the one who remembers our labors in love, and that he has promised that he is going to reward us for the good that we have done, not because we have done it, but simply because of the love that he has shown us in his dear son, Jesus. And so we end the book of Nehemiah on a note of hope, recognizing God's wonderful ability to preserve that which we do for him into eternity, and looking forward to the day that we are going to get to rejoice with faithful Nehemiah and Ezra in the work that God used us to accomplish as we sought to serve him in faith. Thank you for listening to the podcast, and a special thank you to all whose financial contributions make this ministry work. If you would like to support our podcast so that others can be blessed by the family Bible journey as you are, go to our website, familybiblejourney.com, where you can make a one-time contribution, or better yet, become one of our monthly sponsors. Our blessing for today. May you persist in doing good, even when others insist on their own way instead of God's. Amen.